No one could have imagined that in order to desert the army, he had been running through the forest for 5 long days. Behind him, 3 Russian soldiers had been relentlessly pursuing him all this time. For the past 5 days, Józek had been playing a dangerous game of hide-and-seek with them, dodging and outsmarting his pursuers in the dense woods. Just as he was about to cross the Russian border and taste freedom, the 3 alert soldiers spotted his trail. The Russians quickly drew their combat knives, and one of them slashed Józek's left leg without hesitation. Refusing to give up, Józek struggled to his feet and tried to run again, but was violently knocked down by a charging warhorse. Filled with despair, Józek was tied up with a rope by the soldiers, losing his freedom. Soon after, the Russians began dragging him back the way they came. Józek thought his fate was sealed, but then, luck unexpectedly came his way. On their way back, the Russians dragging Józek came across 3 men. The 2 soldiers in front rode past them without paying attention, but the one at the back, the one holding Józek's rope, rudely crashed into one of the men. In the next instant, that man grabbed the rope, and while the Russian turned his head, he swiftly shot him dead. It turned out that these 3 men were not ordinary villagers, they were Polish resistance fighters. Hearing the gunshot, the other 2 Russian soldiers rushed back, but when they saw all 3 guerrillas pointing their guns at them, they realized they were outnumbered and fled, taking their comrade's body with them. And so, Józek was rescued and brought back to the guerrilla camp. Because Józek was a deserter, everyone saw him as a coward, weak and useless. No one wanted to talk to him. This made it even harder for the newcomer to find his place among them. While he sat alone, gulping down his lunch, the guerrilla leader suddenly appeared behind him. The captain invited him to join the resistance and fight alongside them. Although Józek was also Polish, he had deserted the Russian army precisely because he despised war. Now that he had finally regained his freedom, how could he so easily join another fight? But the captain said, "If you can defeat my man, I'll let you go." So, under everyone's watchful eyes, Józek had no choice but to fight for his freedom. He fought with all his strength, but his opponent was far too skilled. In the end, the duel turned into a one-sided beating. Józek's performance only made everyone more convinced that he was a coward and a failure. Then, Tadeusz, the man who had saved Józek from the Russians, threw a pair of shoes at him. He told Józek, "As a Pole, you should fight for Poland's independence." And so, Józek reluctantly joined the Polish guerrilla unit. Soon after, he received his weapon, a small fruit knife. His daily tasks were peeling potatoes, washing vegetables, scrubbing dishes, and cleaning the big pots in the camp kitchen. A few days later, one early morning, the entire guerrilla group packed up and left the camp, heading toward Lodz. They planned to launch a large-scale uprising there. Once hidden in the shadows, the guerrillas had now become a marching rebel army. Józek rode in a wagon at the back of the line, still peeling potatoes non-stop as they traveled. The next afternoon, the rebels liberated a small town guarded by only a dozen Russian soldiers. During the celebration that followed, Józek took the chance to quietly slip away. He planned to go to the train station and take a train straight back home. But just as he reached the square near the station, he saw a rebel soldier lying on the ground, groaning in pain. With his kind heart, Józek rushed over to help. But the very next moment, gunfire erupted. Startled, Józek quickly ducked for cover. Beside him hid a woman holding a baby. Suddenly, another shot rang out. The bullet pierced the wall and struck the woman, killing her instantly. Watching the innocent woman fall to the ground, Józek was filled with rage. Hearing the baby crying in her arms, he could no longer hold back his anger. He stood up, fury burning inside him, and began circling around to flank the Russian sniper hiding above. At that moment, the other rebels, hearing the gunfire, rushed into the square and opened heavy fire on the Russians in the tower. Seizing the opportunity, Józek slowly crept into the tower. Then, Józek pulled out the same little fruit knife he once used to peel potatoes for the uprising army. And while the Russian officer was distracted, he struck swiftly, but the small knife wasn't strong enough. The officer didn't die immediately. Thinking fast, Józek kicked the officer hard, sending him tumbling down the stairs with him. They rolled together, and Józek ended up pinned beneath the officer's heavy body. The Russian seized the chance, wrapping his hands around Józek's throat, trying to strangle him to death. Józek struggled desperately, but he couldn't break free. At that critical moment, he suddenly remembered the fruit knife still lodged in the officer's back. Gathering all his strength, Józek pulled the officer closer and started slapping at the knife's handle with his palm again and again. Finally, the officer's movements slowed, and he let out his last breath. Józek quickly grabbed the pistol from the officer's belt and began quietly crawling upward. At the top of the tower, he spotted another Russian soldier firing down at the rebels. Without hesitation, Józek took aim and pulled the trigger. The soldier wasn't killed instantly and tried to scramble to his feet. Józek fired again, then rushed forward and pushed the wounded soldier off the tower. After this battle, the man everyone had dismissed as a coward, the kitchen helper who only peeled potatoes, finally earned the respect of the entire unit. The captain immediately reassigned him from the kitchen to the combat division. For most soldiers, that would be a proud moment, but Józek felt no joy. He had only planned to sneak away and catch a train to escape the uprising, yet by pure accident, he had become a war hero. Once again, the captain personally brought him into the main fighting force. The man who once wanted nothing more than to run away now had no choice but to put on a uniform and carry a rifle. And so, Józek, who used to spend his days peeling potatoes for others, became a true rebel fighter. From then on, he followed the uprising army across harsh battlefields, fighting side by side with his comrades. Because of his unexpected bravery, he soon became one of the captain's most trusted men. One afternoon, he and the captain went to the riverbank to rendezvous with two female soldiers, but the women accidentally encountered several Russian troops in the nearby forest. One of them was captured by the enemy, determined to save her comrade. The other woman, Dra, gathered her courage and launched a surprise attack. She managed to shoot one Russian soldier, but before she could react, another enemy appeared behind her and knocked her to the ground. Helpless, she could only watch as her captured comrade was shot dead before her eyes. Overcome with rage, she spun around and fired several shots, killing the soldier who had attacked her, then began an intense gunfight with the last remaining Russian. Meanwhile, Józek and his team, who had been waiting by the river, heard the gunfire and raced toward the sound as fast as they could. Dra, still determined to fight the Russians, soon ran out of bullets. The experienced Russian soldier realized she was out of ammunition, but he pretended not to know. Smiling slyly, he stepped out from behind cover, tossed his gun aside, and acted as if he wanted to surrender. Panicked and trembling, Dra thought he was really giving up, so she stepped forward, aiming her empty gun at him, but the next second, the soldier suddenly pulled out a knife and began approaching her slowly. Dra froze, fear surging through her. Her whole body shook as she stumbled backward, yet the Russian kept advancing, his eyes cold and merciless. At that critical moment, Józek arrived just in time and shot the Russian dead. Then, to his shock, he realized that the woman he had just saved was the same girl he met long ago back when the guerrillas had first rescued him from the Russians. He remembered Dra looking down at his injured leg and softly asking if it hurt. That simple gesture of kindness had warmed his exhausted, broken heart back then. From that moment, Józek had never forgotten her, and now fate had brought them together again. Seeing Dra still trembling from fear, Józek felt a surge of emotion. He believed this meeting was destiny, that love had finally found him. He gently stepped forward and pulled Dra into his arms. Still overwhelmed, Dra buried her face against his chest and burst into tears. Just as Józek held her close, he sensed someone approaching from behind. Turning around, he saw Tadeusz, the same man who had once saved his life from the Russians. Dra suddenly pulled away and ran straight into Tadeusz's arms. In that instant, Józek was completely stunned. His brief spark of love ended before it even began, and the man who stole her heart was none other than his own savior. Tadeusz's gaze toward him was complex, filled with both understanding and quiet reproach. Before anyone could speak, a group of Russian soldiers appeared in the distance. The three quickly grabbed their weapons and prepared for battle. The captain and another soldier soon arrived to reinforce them, and an intense firefight broke out. But the enemy's numbers were overwhelming, and the soldier who came with the captain was quickly killed. In the chaos, the captain ordered Dra and her boyfriend Tadeusz to retreat, while he stayed behind with Józek to cover their escape. After a long, desperate fight, Józek and the captain ran out of ammunition and were captured by the Russians. Wanting to survive, Józek dropped his empty rifle willingly. He even begged the captain beside him to stop resisting, trying to convince him that surrender didn't mean cowardice. But the captain, who had already accepted death long ago, would not bow his head. He glared at Józek with disgust, furious at what he saw as weakness, and finally punched him hard in the face. The next second, a Russian soldier hit the captain from behind with a rifle butt, knocking him unconscious. Józek and the captain were taken away and thrown into a prisoner camp. Because the captain was a commander in the Polish uprising, and because of his calm defiance even in captivity, the Russian officer personally tried to persuade him to switch sides. If the captain agreed to join them, the Russians could use it as propaganda to break the morale of the Polish rebels. But no matter how earnestly the Russian officer pleaded, the captain firmly refused. With no other choice, the Russians decided to lock the captain and Józek together in the same cell. Józek tried once again to explain himself, saying, "We were out of bullets. Surrendering wasn't cowardice, it was a chance to survive. To wait for another day when we could fight again. I just don't know if that day will ever come." Hearing his words, the captain fell into deep silence. He slowly lifted his head and saw the names of countless prisoners carved into the cold wall before him. The next morning, they were sent out with other captives for hard labor. A month later, one afternoon, they seized an opportunity, ambushing the guards, stealing their weapons, and beginning a desperate escape. They ran for a long time before finally daring to rest. But when they turned back, they saw Russian soldiers on horseback rapidly closing in. With no choice, they used the last of their strength to keep running. But two men on foot could never outrun mounted soldiers. Soon, the Russians were within range and opened fire. Józek was struck as he fled. At that critical moment, the captain stayed behind to cover him, shouting that he must keep going. "If you survive," he said, "you must keep fighting." Then he raised his gun and fired at the pursuing soldiers. Józek looked back one last time, his heart heavy with grief, before forcing himself to turn and run. In the end, the captain was captured once more while buying Józek time to escape. Again, the Russians offered him a deal if he joined their army. He could live, but even facing death, the captain didn't hesitate for a second. He refused with unwavering resolve. The Russians tied a rope to a tree branch. The captain knew his end had come. He turned toward Poland's direction, knelt down, and began to pray, praying that Józek would make it back safely to the uprising forces, praying that Poland would defeat the Russians and win its freedom. Hidden among the trees, Józek hadn't fled far. He watched helplessly as his captain, the man who had saved his life, was executed before his eyes. In that moment, the man who once only wanted to run away and live in peace finally understood. As long as the Russians ruled, there would be no peace anywhere. He swore to himself that he would keep fighting to honor his captain, to win freedom, and to reclaim his own dignity. Even the Russian officer, moved by the captain's courage, ordered his men to bury the body properly before leaving the area. After they rode away, Józek, wounded and trembling, dragged himself out from the forest. He tried to move a heavy stone toward the captain's grave, pushing when he could, pulling with his shirt when he couldn't. After what felt like forever, he finally placed the stone above the burial site. Eventually, Józek made it back to the Polish resistance camp. Because the hospital lacked anesthetics, he had to endure unbearable pain as doctors operated on him. As he lay there, he suddenly noticed a nurse watching him from across the room. When he looked closer, he realized it was Dra, the woman he had never stopped thinking about. Even though she already had a lover, seeing her again brought a faint, bittersweet warmth to his heart. Caught between pain and joy, Józek screamed in agony and passed out. Days later, once he had recovered enough to move, he immediately went to find Dra, trying to help her with whatever small tasks he could. He knew she loved her boyfriend deeply, but his feelings kept pushing him to stay close to her anyway. Over time, Józek noticed that Dra seemed burdened by sorrow. Her smile had faded, and worry clouded her face every day. When a dance was held at the field hospital to lift everyone's spirits, Józek eagerly invited her to dance, but less than 10 seconds after the music began, Dra abruptly turned away and left without a word. Watching Dra walk away, Józek felt a bitter wave of self-mockery rise inside him. At that moment, he finally understood that maybe he shouldn't have interfered in her life at all. The next morning, he approached her to apologize, then quietly moved to another table, trying to keep a respectful distance. But as he got up to fetch something, he suddenly noticed a boy had appeared out of nowhere and was stealing his breakfast. Quick and alert, Józek caught the boy instantly, but Dra stepped in to stop him. When she learned that the boy was an orphan with nowhere to go, her kind heart couldn't ignore him. She wanted to tidy his messy hair, but the boy resisted fiercely. After several failed attempts, the child even shoved her to the ground. Already weighed down by grief and frustration, Dra threw the scissors aside and stormed off. She walked quickly toward her quarters but soon stopped, leaning against a tree and crying silently. After she left, Józek sat quietly for a moment, then stood up, tossed a pair of shoes to the boy, and picked up the scissors himself to cut the child's hair. The boy sensed Józek's kindness and finally sat still, letting him help. In the days that followed, Józek stopped trying to get close to Dra. Instead, he spent his time caring for the homeless boy, and the two of them found a brief, fragile happiness in the midst of war. But one morning, to his surprise, DRA came to him first. Her sudden approach filled Józek with unexpected joy. The three of them, DRA, Józek, and the boy, shared a rare moment of warmth on the grassy field outside the hospital, a fleeting bit of peace amid chaos. That night, Józek was even more astonished when DRA quietly came to his bedside. Without a word, she removed her coat and lay down behind him, wrapping her arms around him as they both drifted into sleep. The next morning, DRA finally opened her heart. She told him that while Józek had been held in the Russian prison camp, her boyfriend, Tadeusz, had been killed in battle. That was why she had been so silent, lost, and heartbroken all this time, with no one left standing between them. Józek and DRA soon became a couple, but happiness is always short-lived. A few days later, Józek recovered and was ready to return to the front lines. When he went to say goodbye to DRA at the hospital, she was nowhere to be found. One of her friends told him she was hanging sheets on the hillside behind the hospital, but Józek immediately sensed something wasn't right from the woman's uneasy expression. He rushed to the hill and there, just as he feared, he found DRA, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was Tadeusz alive. The same man who had been reported dead had somehow survived and returned. Józek froze in disbelief. When DRA turned and saw her supposedly dead lover standing there, she thought she was hallucinating. In shock, she slowly reached out, touching his face to make sure he was real. When she realized he was truly alive, panic flooded her heart. She hurriedly grabbed her shoes and coat, then quietly ran off in confusion. Tadeusz stood stunned, not understanding what was happening. He followed her, demanding to know why she was acting so strangely. Why, after he had fought his way back from the edge of death to find her, she looked at him with such guilt and fear. He followed her for 2 long hours until DRA finally stopped and confessed the truth. "When I saw your name on the death list," she said, "my world collapsed. I couldn't breathe under the weight of grief. I had nothing to live for, so I accepted Józek's love, to give myself a reason to keep going. But now you've come back from the dead. Tell me, what should I do?" Hearing this, Tadeusz fell silent. Fate, it seemed, had played a cruel and absurd joke on them all. Just then, Józek appeared. Seeing Tadeusz alive, he stood frozen, while DRA, filled with shame, lowered her head. Unable to look at either of them, Tadeusz stared at Józek in silence. Józek stared back. Neither spoke a word. Then Tadeusz turned toward DRA and said quietly, "I promised you I would come back alive. And I did. I gave everything to keep that promise." With those words, he left, his heart full of anger and pain. DRA watched him go, guilt pressing heavily on her chest. She looked at Józek, still standing there in silence, then turned to leave, but he caught her arm. They stood staring at each other for a moment before DRA whispered softly, "Give me some time." Józek slowly released his grip and watched her walk away. Heartbroken and angry, he returned to the front line, where, to his disbelief, he saw Tadeusz again, his rival, sitting nearby, furiously smoking one cigarette after another. Józek sat quietly across from him, staring, saying nothing. Then, the Russians began their assault. The officer ordered the men to retreat from the first trench to the second, not out of fear, but because they had hidden explosives in the first line. Once the Russians entered it, they planned to detonate and destroy them. When the Russians poured into the first trench, the commander gave the order to ignite the charges, but the firing line had been severed during the earlier bombardment. The explosives wouldn't go off. As the enemy prepared to advance toward the second trench, Tadeusz suddenly threw down his cigarette, pulled out his pistol, and climbed out of cover, determined to fix the broken detonator himself. He crawled under heavy fire, tracing the wire through the mud. Finally, he found the damaged section and started to reconnect it. Meanwhile, in the second trench, the demolition operator kept pressing the trigger, unaware of what was happening. The moment Tadeusz repaired the wire, the explosives went off in a massive blast. The explosion tore through the first trench, throwing Tadeusz into the air and leaving him critically wounded. He lay on the ground, barely breathing, staring up at the dark sky as his consciousness faded. Back in the trench, Józek hesitated for a long time. He knew that if Tadeusz died, DRA would be his forever, but in the end, he couldn't do it. He climbed out and ran straight toward the battlefield. Shells exploded all around him, but he didn't stop. He reached Tadeusz, shouting his name, shaking him until he opened his eyes. Just then, another explosion went off nearby. Instinctively, Józek threw himself over Tadeusz to shield him, but the furious Tadeusz pushed him away. He cursed Józek, calling him the man who stole his love, and tried to crawl back toward the trench, but his injuries were too severe. Despite the insults, Józek refused to leave him. He hoisted Tadeusz onto his back and started running through the firestorm. A shell exploded nearby, knocking them both to the ground, but Józek kept getting up, again and again, dragging Tadeusz forward with sheer willpower. The Russian commander, furious over his soldiers' deaths, spotted the two men in the open and ordered his artillery to fire directly at them. Shells rained down relentlessly, but Józek kept moving, stumbling through the blasts until he finally reached safety and carried Tadeusz back to the hospital. When Dra saw her lover, bloodied and dying, she froze in horror. In that moment, she made her choice. She turned to Józek and softly said 3 words: "I'm sorry." Dra chose Tadeusz. Crushed and heartbroken, Józek stood there in silence, then quietly turned and walked away. When he returned to the trenches, his comrades began singing a battle song in his honor. Even the commanding officer saluted him with deep respect. The man who once wanted nothing more than to escape had now earned the admiration of everyone around him. Józek had lost love but gained honor. Thinking of how fate had twisted his life, Józek could only smile bitterly. I'm a movie enthusiast. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.